The camera had been his lawyer's idea, not for surveillance. That word implied suspicion, and Edward Calloway did not feel suspicious of the woman he had hired. He felt afraid. Afraid in the specific, helpless way of a father whose daughter cannot yet speak and cannot yet tell him what her days are like when he is not there, which is most of them. Because running a company across 4 time zones does not pause for fear. His daughter's name was Iris. She was 2 years old, and she had been born alongside her twin sister Clara in the early hours of a March morning that Edward would never entirely recover from. Not because anything went wrong, but because nothing in his life before that moment had prepared him for the size of what he felt when 2 small people arrived and became, immediately and permanently, the most important things he had ever been responsible for. Clara walked at 14 months. Iris did not walk at 14 months. The pediatric neurologist used careful language to explain what that meant, and Edward sat in the small chair across the desk and listened and understood every word and felt none of them land in a way that he could manage yet. Iris had a condition affecting motor development on her left side. She would walk. The doctor was confident about that. The timeline was not certain. The work required would be significant. The specialist recommended a pediatric physical therapist, a supportive home environment, and patience in the specific active sense of the word. Not waiting, but continuing. Edward hired a maid and household manager named Adaeze Okonkwo, who came with references so thorough they bordered on overwhelming, and who had, in the interview, looked directly at Iris in her floor seat and said hello to her before saying anything to Edward, which he had noticed and had not forgotten. She started on a Monday. The camera was installed on a Friday 2 weeks later, at the lawyer's suggestion, framed as standard practice for household staff in properties of this value. Edward had agreed without enthusiasm, because the lawyer was right that it was standard, and because the fear had not gone away, and because a camera felt like something, even if something was not the same as being there. He watched the footage in 15-minute segments late at night after the transatlantic calls were done. He watched it for 3 days before he saw what changed everything. Before we begin, if you believe that the people who show up quietly and without recognition are often the ones doing the most important work, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people today. Adaeze Okonkwo was 34 years old and had been working in household management for 9 years, since arriving in the country at 25 with a background in early childhood education from a university back home that the credentialing board here required her to revalidate before it counted for anything official, which she was in the process of doing, one examination at a time, around the edges of full-time work and a life that left narrow margins for anything extra. She had 3 children of her own, aged 8, 6, and 4, who lived with her mother during the week when Adaeze's hours made the logistics impossible, and who she brought home on weekends with the focused, grateful energy of someone who knows exactly what they have been missing and intends to be fully present for every hour of it. She had taken the position at the Calloway house because it paid well and because the children needed something she recognized. Not pity. She did not operate in pity. What she recognized was potential that had not yet found its footing, and that was something she knew what to do with. What Edward saw on the camera on the 3rd day was this. He had expected to see his daughter in her floor seat. He had expected to see Clara playing nearby. He had expected to see Adaeze moving through the house doing the work she had been hired to do. What he saw instead was Adaeze on the floor, not sitting, kneeling, in her uniform. On the hardwood floor of the sunlit front room, knees on the wood, back straight, arms extended toward Iris, who was standing upright in her small walker, which she used but had never traveled more than a few steps in without stopping, gripping the handles with the concentration of someone who is attempting something that costs everything she has. Adaeze was talking. Edward could not hear the words through the camera, but he could read the body. He could see the lean, the complete forward attention, the hands open and waiting not to catch Iris but to receive her, the difference being everything, the difference being the distance between someone who expects a child to fall and someone who expects her to arrive. Clara was beside a daze, clapping, not performed clapping. The real kind, the unself-conscious full-body clapping of a 2-year-old who is genuinely delighted by something and has not yet learned to modulate delight for an audience. Iris took 3 steps, then 4, then 5. Then she reached Adaisy's hands and grabbed them, and Adaise lifted her and held her up and said something that made Iris laugh. A laugh Edward had not heard before. Not the small, daily laugh, but the full one. The one from the center. The one that meant something had happened that was worth the whole effort of the day. Clara kept clapping. Edward sat at his desk at 11:30 at night in a city 3 time zones away and watched his daughter take 5 steps, and he put his hand over his mouth and did not move for a long time. He watched the next day's footage. Adaise was on the floor again. Different starting position. Slightly more distance. The same open hands, the same forward attention. Iris made 6 steps, then stopped, then tried again, then made 4 more. He watched the day after that. 7 steps, then 8. Then a sequence of 12 that ended with Iris letting go of the walker entirely for 2 seconds and standing unsupported before sitting down hard on the floor and looking at her own hands as though they had done something surprising. Adaise put her hand over her heart. Clara said something to Iris that 2-year-olds say to each other in the language that belongs only to them. Iris laughed again. Edward booked the first available flight home. Before we continue, we want to stop here. Because what Adaise did on that floor every day was visible on a camera, but invisible to the world in the way that the most important work almost always is. And Kindness Tales wants you to know what had been quietly shaping Adaise into the person who knelt on that floor. There was a teacher named Mrs. Adeyemi, who had taught Adaise at age 9 in a classroom that had too many students and not enough books, and who had stayed after school twice a week to work with the children she identified as needing more than the standard day could give them. Adaise had been one of them. Mrs. Adeyemi had never described this as extra. She had described it as Tuesday and Thursday. Adaise had become a teacher because of Mrs. Adeyemi. She still knew it clearly. There was a pediatric physiotherapist named Dr. Mensah who had worked at a clinic near where Adaise grew up and who had allowed Adaise to observe sessions during a school placement year, treating her not as a student to be managed, but as a person to be taught. Dr. Mensah had said once, in the middle of a session, without stopping what she was doing, "The child always knows more about what they can do than we do. Our job is to create the conditions and then get out of the way." Adaise had written it down. She still had it. There was a neighbor named Miss Gloria who had watched Adaise's children on the evenings when the credentialing examinations fell on days that could not be rearranged, who had done this 17 times over 3 years, who charged nothing and said only that children needed feeding and she had a pot on anyway. Miss Gloria had never used the word sacrifice about any of it. It was not sacrifice to her. It was just Tuesday. It was just Thursday. It was just a pot on the stove. These were the people who made Adaise. The people who showed up in the small ways that accumulate into a person's capacity to show up for others. She did not think of herself as carrying their legacy. She just did on that floor every day what had been done for her in rooms and on afternoons that the world had not noticed either. Edward landed on a Thursday afternoon. He came through the front door at 4 o'clock, which was Iris's best hour. The pediatric therapist had told him, the hour when her energy was highest and her frustration was lowest and the work went best. Adaise was on the floor. She had not heard him come in. He stood in the doorway of the front room with his bag still on his shoulder and watched. Iris was at the walker. Clara was in position beside Adaise, already beginning to clap in the anticipatory way that suggested she knew what was coming. Adaise's hands were open. The light was coming through the windows, the way it came through in the late afternoon, long and warm across the hardwood floor. Iris took a step, then another. Then she looked up and saw her father in the doorway, and her face did the thing faces do when they see the person they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She let go of the walker. She stood for 3 seconds. Then she took 4 steps toward him and fell into his arms, and he caught her and held her and did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Adayezi sat back on her heels and looked at the floor with the quiet expression of someone who understands that the moment belongs to someone else and is completely at peace with that. Clara patted Adayezi on the arm in the consoling, companionable way of a 2-year-old who has assessed the emotional situation and decided that physical contact is the appropriate response. Adayezi smiled. Edward looked at her over Iris's shoulder. He said, "How long has she been doing this?" Adayezi said, "The 5 steps were day 3. We have been building since then." He said, "You didn't tell me." She said, "I wanted her to show you herself." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the first person a child shows something to matters. She knew you were coming. Children always know." He looked at his daughter, who had buried her face in his neck in the way she did when she was somewhere between awake and overwhelmed. He said, "The camera." Adayezi looked at him. He said, "I watch the footage every night." She said nothing. He said, "I want you to know that what I saw on that camera is the reason I came home early and the reason this conversation is happening. And I want to ask you something directly." She waited. He said, "What do you need? Not for the job, for yourself, the qualification you're working toward, the examinations, the children during the week. Tell me what removing those obstacles looks like." She looked at him for a long moment, not with suspicion, with the careful attention of a person who has learned to distinguish between offers that are performances and offers that are real. She told him. He listened the way she had listened to Iris, with his full forward attention, without filling the spaces. When she finished, he said, "I can help with most of that. Not to make it easy, to make it possible." She said, "Those are different things." He said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "Your daughter is going to walk without the walker by summer. I am certain of it." He said, "I believe you." Iris had fallen asleep on his shoulder. Clara had moved on to an investigation of something near the window that required her complete attention. The light came through the room the way it came through in the late afternoon, and the house was quiet, in the way houses are quiet when something important has just finished happening and the people in it are still sitting with it. Adayezi rose from the floor, smoothed her uniform, and went to start dinner. She passed Miss Gloria's number on the way through the kitchen, written on a card pinned to the board beside the refrigerator, and touched it briefly with one finger the way you touch something that has been essential. Tuesday, Thursday, a pot on the stove. The quiet work that holds the world up while nobody is watching. Except sometimes someone is watching. And sometimes that changes everything. If this story stayed with you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of quiet dedication, unexpected grace, and the people who show up every day without asking for recognition. Because the most important work in the world is almost always done on someone's knees, on a hardwood floor, with open hands, and a child taking one more step than yesterday. Welcome to Kindness Tales. We are so glad you are here.